What's the creepiest place you've been? Forest Haven is an abandoned insane asylum in Maryland. It's posted no trespassing and technically patrolled by guards, but in reality is very easy to get into. I was there 2 weeks ago with my son, exploring and taking photos. There are 22 buildings on the property, all just wide open and abandoned, covered in collapsed ceiling tiles, broken glass, and graffiti. There is still furniture in some of the rooms, and if you delve deep enough into the property, you can still find patient records that were left behind when they closed. We actually found a stack of patient files in a dark, windowless room. It was so surreal, reading about a severely mentally retarded man with a history of schizophrenia who talks incessantly. This patient had a one-page handwritten summary for every year that he had been in the hospital, and they all started out the same. Kenny is an almost 45-year-old white male with severe mental retardation and a history of schizophrenia. He has been at Forest Haven for 5 years. Only the age and duration change from page to page. The first one is dated 1973, and the last page in his file is a printed memorial flyer showing he died in September of 1990. The facility was ordered to close in 1974, but didn't actually close its doors until 1991. In its last year of operation, there were 9 deaths at the asylum. Kenny was one of them. The creepiest part? The patient whose file I randomly opened up to, in the middle of a stack of wet, moldering files, sitting on the corner of a collapsing desk in an interior room of an abandoned basement. He shared the same first and middle. About 22 years ago now, shit getting old, I explored an old abandoned farmhouse, same sort of situation. Like they'd just gotten up and left. There was a newspaper on a chair in the living room from 1960. Really well-preserved place, considering. I went upstairs and there were blankets draped over the mirrors. So I think an older person died and their family just abandoned the place. The place continued to deteriorate over the years and finally got torn down. It was spooky as heck when I was exploring, especially as the sun was going down, just as I decided to check out the attic. I got a glimpse of an old crib and other old baby stuff before the attic access door fell with a slam, and I noped right the F out of there. I found an old abandoned farmhouse a little ways outside of my little town. It looked as if the people who had lived there just up and left one day. There were still dishes in the sink and a coffee cup with a newspaper beside it on the kitchen table. The date was in 2011. All their clothes were still hanging in the closet. State fair ribbons were stuck all over one wall, one dating back to 1912. Had it not been for the thick layer of dust covering everything, animal droppings, and their little footprints in the dust, you'd think someone still lived there, but no. To make it creepier, I explored the house at about 3 a.m. The silence of that place felt so heavy and it made me very uncomfortable being there. I later asked around about the house, and apparently it belonged to an old couple whose children put them in a nursing home and just abandoned the house. I was in a youth hostel in the Netherlands. The bathroom windows were curtained not by cloth or blinds, but from being caked in spider webs and thousands of spiders. More spiders than I have ever seen in my life. The windows barely let in any light at all. And the spiders were fed by the insane amount of mosquitoes. Biggest spiders I have ever seen as well, other than tarantulas at the zoo. Spiders in the NL are not supposed to be that big. I never knew bugs could be obese before. Additional info. This happened a long time ago, when smartphones were just coming on the market. I was there on a 2-night school trip with like 60 other kids. I don't recall the exact location, but we were there to see a Dutch West India Company ship, so I think we were near Amsterdam, but in a smaller town. The hostel was by a pond. Additional creepiness. To those saying the spiders at least helped with the mosquitoes, they didn't. The spiders stayed glued to the windows. In the morning, no one wanted to be the first to shower, because the shower stalls were coated in mosquitoes. The showers were okay after 1 or 2 people had gone because most of them got splashed off. We were allowed to swim in the nearby pond, but had to use the little dock, because if you walked in from the shore, your feet would be cut up by broken glass from former tenants' discarded beer bottles. The lawn was dotted with duck and goose poop, and one girl sat in it by accident during an outdoor activity, and got a massive shit stain on her pink jeans. The more I recall, the more I shudder. I had a bad case of hay fever, and my eyes went so red on one day I did get an infected bug bite on that trip, which caused some serious health problems. And I got home on a Sunday, so no doctors were open, all businesses in NL typically close on Sundays, and so my mom had to run down the street to ask a neighbor who happened to be a doctor for help. He did not appreciate it. Luckily, there aren't really any venomous insects in Holland. Honesty, with how many health code violation that place must have had, I imagine it must be closed by now. Or maybe someone did the right thing and burned it down. They probably would have gotten an insurance payout because, as I can tell most of you understand, burning that place down is a thing that needed to be done. I was on a family vacation to Atlanta, about 1972. We went to visit some cousins of my grandmother's. Twin sisters, never married, in their 80s. The house was in a rundown neighborhood. From the street you'd think it was abandoned. Overgrown yard, part of the roof caved in, boarded up windows. Inside, it was all antiques and furniture from the 30s and 40s, slowly deteriorating, and it looked as though they hadn't dusted in years. Wallpaper peeling, old portraits half fallen. Looking up to the second floor from the stairs, just cobwebs and collapsed ceilings. They said they hadn't been up there in years. And definitely rat noises. They both looked and lived like ghosts, and seemed half mad, very civil and proper but off. As an 8-year-old, I was terrified, especially when one of them joked and said, "You should leave him here. He can live with us." I burst into tears, and we left. My old house. About 5 years ago I was living in a town just outside of Washington, D.C. The house was a short 2-story house with a basement that was built in the 50s. The whole house has a weird vibe to it, not exactly scary, but unsettling. In 2011, the year that we moved in, the guy that built the house stopped by. He told us that he built the house with his dad and 3 brothers in 1952. During the building they found a few skeletons while they were digging out the driveway and of course called the police. Turns out the bodies were Union soldiers from the Civil War, who had most likely been killed during the Battle of Bull Run, and buried as the Union Army marched back to D.C. Also, the basement was unfinished, flooded constantly, and had a spricket infestation. In high school my friends and I would go up to the local abandoned state mental hospital to explore. The rooms were mostly creepy from the state of decay they were in. There was a lot of graffiti, with things like 666 and bands names, Tool, Marilyn Manson, spray painted on the walls. The graffiti wasn't creepy, just markings from other teenagers. Sometimes we would find bullet casings scattered on the floor. However, the creepiest area I saw were the underground tunnels. A security guard caught us on the property and told us to come back in a half hour after the statey did their rounds. We met up with him and he took us down into the tunnels that staff would have used to travel between buildings. I just remember how dark it was, and he was the only one with a flashlight, as that cell phones at this time were Nokia bricks. The other creepy part was when he drove us around the property in his Dodge Caravan that had his cat in it. Dry cat food was all over the floor. 16-year-old me was really stupid, hahaha. Even though nothing bad happened, it always sounds like the makings of a horror movie. This was at Metropolitan State Hospital, Met State, in Waltham, Ma. Like many other old hospitals, it was torn down and turned into condos. Only an administrative building still exists. There is a little cemetery, Metfern, in the woods nearby where you can find the gravestones of the patients. They are only marked with C's and P's, Catholic, Protestant, and their patient numbers. I like to stop by every now and then to pay my respects. I have noticed that someone comes by, I assume on religious holidays, and leaves a flower on every grave. My family went house hunting one weekend, and we came across one in Salem, Ma, that had been built in the 1700s. It looked it, inside and out. The lady who'd been showing us houses really tried to push us to commit to this one. It was a decent enough house size-wise and in pretty decent shape, but none of us could shake the eerie gut feeling we got as we were going through it. We all admitted that the creepy feeling was the strongest when we opened the basement door. None of us was brave enough to go down. When we got a moment to ourselves, my mom said she'd gotten the vibe that bad things had happened in that house. Like, people had been killed or something. We all admitted we'd gotten the same feeling and politely noped right out of there. In a B&B in the Isle of Skye in Scotland. It was right next to a nursing home that was suspiciously silent. It was right above the sea at October, and it was very windy and cold. The B&B owner was a very old lady with ton of porcelain figures in the house. The room she rented as a B&B was in the top floor of her house. It was very creepy. We just went in to see the room out of respect to the lady and got the hell out from there. One year I worked in a haunted house that was inside a building that used to be a funeral home. The morgue was downstairs and still had the drawers. My job was to lay in the drawer and pop out when people walked by. Laying in a cramped drawer, in the dark, on cold metal, with flashes of lights and screams in the distance was probably the creepiest place. I scared so many people, including a middle school-aged kid who straight up pooped his pants and a drunk college chick who peed. So it was kind of worth it. Operating room for brain surgery. It's freezing cold. They wheel you up to the stainless steel bed with a cage you put your head in. They tighten down clamps on your head so it can't move. Then knock you out. You wake up multiple times over a 4.5-hour surgery, semi-conscious, eyes closed, but you can say, "I hear you guys," or snap your fingers and hold a finger up like waiter, and the anesthesiologist hits you with a dose. After they're done, they poke a giant needle, ice pick, into different facial muscles to make sure they didn't break anything. Poking it into a muscle causes a subconscious flinching, and they look at the muscle group flinching to make sure each category is still rigged up. I had a bunch of scabs and taped cotton balls across my face and scalp. Then they seal up your skull and sign off on it. They use reciprocating saws and similar power tools to carpenters. It's morbid, terrifying, cold. But it can give you your life back. I spent 2 nights in the hospital and was driving to work 7 days later feeling like $1,000,000. One time me and my brother were hiking and came across an old one-room schoolhouse next to an old fire road or something. We decided to stay the night in it, and late at night some drunk teens came beating on the doors, yelling "wake up" or something like that. Then my brother yelled no, and those kids got out of there so good damn quick. We ran into a local the next day who told us that the schoolhouse is supposed to be haunted. So that's how me and my brother helped build upon an urban legend. When I was a kid, we lived in my dad's old house, from when he was a kid. It was one of the oldest houses in town and had been there since the 1800s, but had been redone a few times. The house had 3 bedrooms, a master that used to be a screened-in porch, a regular room and a room off to the side that was barely big enough for a twin bed. When my dad was about 11, his older brother died of heart failure and they had his coffin put in that room for the viewing. When my grandfather died about 10 years later, his was put there too. When I was born, my grandmother offered the house to my parents, as she'd gotten remarried, so they took it for $30 a month. That room always creeped me out for some reason growing up and I didn't like going in there. When I was older and renting the house from my grandma myself, that's when my dad told me about the viewings. Still was a creepy room and I kept only things I didn't use on a regular basis in there.